Good morning, everyone. I'm Brenda Foster. I'm president of AmCham Shanghai. And on behalf of the Chamber and Booz & Company, we're delighted to welcome you here today to our 2012 China Consumer Market Strategies Report. For those of you who were with us last year, you're going to see a little bit of a change this year in terms of the report. And we have an excellent panel who will be working with us and explaining everything to us. And I can't thank Booz & Company enough for all of the work, the analysis, the support, and everything they've given us. And it's probably not a surprise to hear when you look at the Chinese consumer that most things that have to deal with China is that it's to be one of the largest consumer markets in the world by 2015. And what we're going to talk about today is what is really driving the consumer market. And perhaps to most of us here, what we really want to know is how are companies responding to these trends. This second annual report, which was produced jointly by AmCham Shanghai and Booz & Company, really surveyed, I think, more than 150 Chinese companies and U.S. companies, and we wanted to see how they were competing in the consumer market. It is really a first of a kind of a report that gives a clear picture of how both the Chinese and multinational private and state-owned companies are responding to just the explosion in Chinese consumer activity. The report will reveal 9 trends that are making China's consumer market not only the world's fastest growing market, but perhaps the most challenging and certainly the most competitive. I again want to thank Booz & Company, and I particularly want to thank Joni Bessler, who I'm going to introduce here in a minute, who's been the director of the Shanghai office. I'd also like to thank Adam Xu, Simon Sun, Yun Qin, also from the Booz office, who were so instrumental in the report's success. Joni's going to be introducing our panelists in a few minutes, but I would personally like to thank them. Haiyan Wang, Chief Marketing Officer for Kraft Foods China. Cindy Lin, Senior Director for the Franchise Management for PepsiCo China Beverages. Chin Lim Ong, Director of Strategic Initiatives and Competitive Intelligence, New Business Development and Planning for GM China Group, and Vineet Arora, who is also the Executive Partner of Havas Digital. And finally, I would also like to thank not only the Chinese companies, but the AmCham Shanghai member companies who are here today and who also participated in this report. It was critical when they met with our team. They provided us invaluable feedback on really what is the fastest growing market here. And finally, I would like to thank the AmCham Shanghai staff, particularly our communications and publications staff, led by David Basmajian, because they worked just tirelessly on this report together with Booz & Company. So with that, would you please join me in welcoming Joni Bessler, who's going to give us an overview of today's survey results. Joni?
Okay, let me start with a question and a show of hands. How many of you in the audience were here last year during the 2011 presentation? Alrighty. And how many of you either personally filled out the survey or at least saw the survey by somebody else that filled it out in your company? Okay, so, excuse me, maybe let me take a step back and just introduce in a little bit greater detail what this survey was. The overall purpose of the survey was to understand and very explicitly to compare how multinational companies and Chinese companies see the consumer China marketplace. Can I have a little bit more of the lights because it's really hard to talk in the dark? A little bit more, thank you. Okay, and we were specifically trying to understand 3 things. The first thing that we were trying to understand is what trends companies believe are shaping the consumer marketplace. And we'll talk about those trends in a moment. The second thing that we were trying to understand is how prepared companies felt they are to respond to those trends. And then the third thing that we were looking to understand is what actions and or barriers companies highlight against each of those trends. Okay? This year, we had over 150 participating companies. About 45% of them were multinationals, and within multinationals, the vast majority were Western multinationals. And about 55% of them were Chinese companies, and the Chinese companies split, interestingly, about a third, a third, a third. A third of them were state-owned enterprises, a third of them were mainland Chinese companies, and a third of them were Hong Kong and or Taiwanese companies. By industry focus, what you can see is roughly 20% were auto, and I know there's a lot of auto representatives in the room. About 40% were consumer of one type or another, and then there was a pretty good distribution across other industry sectors, healthcare, financial services, professional services, and the like. We pre-populated the survey with 9 trends. And this is a little different. For those of you that are familiar with last year's survey, this is a little bit different than last year, given some of the guidance that we received from our steering group. The 9 trends split into 3 distinct categories. The first category is changes in consumer attitudes. Second category is around external trends, including technology. And then the third category was demographic changes. And you'll notice there's only one trend in that. What we were explicitly not doing is, once again, looking at the one-child policy, the overall aging of the population, trends that have been looked at over and over again that are kind of exogenous. They're kind of demographically driven. So these were the 3 categories. And within the 3 categories, we pre-populated the survey with 9 trends. Just very quickly, let me run through them. But the one that I want to just explain is the first one, value as a differentiator. In this case, when we're talking about value, we're talking about the willingness to pay a premium for higher quality, more features, more safety, higher service. So we're not talking about, those of you that might be Americans in the room or familiar with American stores, we're not talking about Walmart value. Okay? The rest of them you could read: health and wellness, work-life balance, exposure to and knowledge of foreign markets, growth of consumer choice, e-commerce, social media, investments in infrastructure, and the evolution of the family unit. So those were the 9 trends we looked at. After analyzing all the survey data, we would highlight 3 kind of big takeaways or 3 conclusions. I'm going to very quickly summarize them because then we're going to go through each of them in greater detail. Key takeaway number 1. There is no doubt that the China consumer marketplace is maturing. And what came out of this survey was 2 very distinct buying behaviors, if not distinct consumer segments. And we're going to call the first one the value consumer and the second one the choice consumer. And we'll talk about those. The second key takeaway is around the topic of convergence. In stark contrast to last year, this year's survey respondents report huge convergence between how the multinationals and the Chinese companies both see the trends, are taking actions against the trends, and even see the same challenges to address the trends. And then finally, the last kind of key takeaway is around Brenda's question of, what do companies do next? And we'll talk about the 4 key capability areas and how companies might want to think about the strategies that sit beneath those capability areas. Okay? Let me just grab it. Okay, key takeaway number 1. First thing we want to share with you was the rank order of the 9 trends. And what was really interesting to us this year is that trends 1 and 2, by the way, 1 is the lowest, trends 1 and 2 were identical when you compare the multinationals and the Chinese companies. The first trend, value as a differentiator, right at the top, and actually at the top, by a long shot. And the second trend, the exponential growth of consumer choice. Now, when you look below those top two trends, you do start to see some divergence. On the multinational side, you see that social media and e-commerce are right at the top. On the Chinese side, you see a slightly different picture with health and wellness and the evolution of the family unit kind of being the next two. And when we have the panel on the stage, if you want to explore why we see differences beneath the top two, we certainly can. What I want to do, though, is focus on the top two. So as we analyze the data still further, what emerged, as I already said, is we saw these two very distinct types of buying behavior and arguably perhaps consumers themselves. So let's talk about the value consumer. Who's the value consumer? The value consumer, according to survey respondents, so this is the 150 companies that described this consumer to us, live predominantly in tiers 1 and 2, aged 21 to 50, but actually concentrated around 31 to 40 years. So if you go into the detailed material, you can see the bell. And it's not that everybody is 21 to 30 years, but you can see the spread, 31 to 40 years, and you'll see the concentration. Mid to high income, roughly 10,000 to 50,000 RMB per month. We then asked respondents, how is this trend going to affect consumer behavior? And there was remarkable consistency. Respondents believe that this trend will encourage or create a willingness to pay more for higher quality. And we're using quality broadly defined. It's quality, it's efficacy, it's safety, it's features, it's after service, etc. And this trend will increase loyalty to specific brands, presumably brands that deliver against the promise. With respect to shopping behavior, respondents told us that this trend is going to drive an increased desire for information. We also asked respondents what capabilities they felt were important to address this trend and how ready they felt they were against those capabilities. Let me take a minute and explain this exhibit, because this was, at least for us, a very interesting set of findings. So first of all, we've split the exhibit into two halves, the multinationals on your left, the Chinese companies on your right. On the horizontal axis is how important specific capabilities are. So if you look to the far right, in both MNCs and Chinese companies, what you see is that branding and product development innovation in both segments is viewed as the two top required capabilities for this trend being value as a differentiator. On the vertical dimension is what we'll call the readiness. So how ready do the respondents feel to address that capability or to have that capability? And here's where you start to see some differences. On the product development, innovation, they're roughly about the same level for the purposes of a survey. But when you look at branding, what you see is that the Chinese companies feel a lot less prepared around the capability of branding. We also had the data to split Chinese companies, and what we can also tell you is that of the three segments of Chinese companies that I introduced, the SOEs feel the absolute least prepared. So if you did that scatter plot just for Chinese companies, what you'd see is SOEs dropping even further. We also asked each of the respondents for each trend who they feel is best prepared to respond. And again, let me explain how to interpret this exhibit, because this format's going to appear a few times. So take, for example, yellow. Yellow is MNCs. So if you take a look at how MNCs responded, 59% of the MNC respondents believe that Western companies, or MNCs, are most prepared to respond. They believe 12% of Hong Kong Taiwanese companies, 21% Chinese companies. Or you could look at the blue. The Chinese companies believed 69% of MNCs, Western MNCs, are most prepared, etc. And given what I just said a moment ago about the sense of readiness for one of the two most important capabilities, i.e. branding, this was not a huge surprise that all segments believe that Western MNCs are most prepared. So that's the value consumer. Let's talk about the choice consumer. The choice consumer also lives in Tier 1, 2, but there's a much bigger presence in Tier 3. Slightly younger, clustered more around 21 to 30 years of age, and a relatively speaking lower income group, more in the 5 to 25,000 RMB per month. We asked the same questions about how this trend is going to affect consumer behavior. On the, on the willingness to pay, this was interesting. From a willingness to pay perspective, there is an expectation to pay less for similar quality. But there is a willingness to pay a premium for higher quality. So it's a little bit more divided. However, the trend in totality is viewed as driving reduced loyalty to specific brands. From a shopping behavior standpoint, you see the same emphasis on information. So those of you in the audience from marketing communication, branding, anybody in the room that's from the digital side, this topic of the need or the thirst for more and more information came out very, very loudly in this survey. Again, we asked the question, who do you feel is better prepared? Now, this was interesting because the MNCs believe they're better prepared, and the Chinese companies believe they're better prepared. So kind of the race is on to see who really captures this segment or this segment of buying behavior. Okay, let me move on to the second key takeaway. And this takeaway, just to reiterate, is on the topic of convergence. Okay, apologies in advance for this exhibit. It's a horrible exhibit to share with a large audience. But what we wanted to do was kind of give you the big picture. So the first question that we asked is, how ready do you feel you are for these trends, for these 9 trends? And we gave respondents 3 choices. So to your far left is fully prepared. In the middle is, somewhat prepared, doing a lot of the right things. And to your far right is, shoot, we're not prepared at all. And we asked each respondent to tell us where they felt they were. Kind of at a holistic level, what you could say is, the MNCs are slightly more skewed toward, I'm really prepared. The Chinese companies are more clustered in the middle. But if you stand back and you look at the exhibit holistically, what struck us is it's a pretty even distribution. It's a pretty even mosaic. And again, this is quite different than what we saw last year. Last year, for those of you that might remember the data, there was a heavy skew on the MNC side of we're not ready, we're not prepared. even more startling for us was to take a look at the ranking of what capabilities respondents viewed as critical to go after these trends, or in this case, got in the way of the trends. And if you scan your eyes, what you see is the rank order is almost identical. The only one that really jumps out as an exception is the topic of branding. So, excuse me, the topic of innovation. So see, lack of innovation capability. So the lack of innovation capability was called out by Chinese companies, but other than that one specific capability, from top to bottom, organization structure, human resources, technology, dot, 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 dot. Again, this was in huge contrast to last year. Last year, actually, the MNC report was kind of the same. But the Chinese companies, the only capability that they really called out as believing that it was a major, major barrier to what they were trying to do in the marketplace was the organizational structure and processes. That one was really high, and the rest were actually quite low. So this year we look at it, there's convergence amongst the trends, there's convergence around what's important, there's convergence around what capabilities they need, and you can only stand back and conclude this market is going to get more and more competitive. A couple other slides that we want to share with you. They're a little bit more random, but we did want to share with you a couple of the findings around e-commerce, social media, given how big a topic it is here in China as well as globally. Again, the same question, who do you feel is most prepared? And remarkable convergence. So both the multinationals and the Chinese companies believe that Chinese companies are far more prepared on the topic of e-commerce. But interestingly, the exact opposite came out as it relates to social media. And what struck us wasn't necessarily the conclusion, but the degree of consistency in how it's viewed. We would tell you, however, that the MNCs are closing the gap with e-commerce. So if you take a look at last year's data and this year's data, last year, 8% of MNCs had 10% of their sales from e-commerce channels. This year, they report it's up to 15%. Last year, 41% of MNCs had no plans to adopt an e-commerce channel. That's come down this year to 34%. So the gap is closing, but the gap still exists. A few other highlights, again, as compared to last year. Chinese companies continue to outnumber the multinationals in expanding their R&D centers. So the bars to look at are the second set of bars. You can see 30%, well, let's start with the Chinese. 49% of Chinese companies say they are planning to expand, in contrast to 30% of multinational companies. And again, I have last year's data, and that gap was much larger. So Chinese are still leading the way, but the gap is closing. And finally, people challenges. Sadly, I think the most we can say about people challenges is they still persist. Very few, if any, companies have really cracked the code on people. One of the things that we Boos are always interested in is in trying to see how many of the top-level positions, and we'll define top-level as CEO and direct reports, are Chinese. And again, this is reported by the companies, but what you see is it certainly hasn't gotten better, and arguably, it's actually gotten worse. So if you take a look at the top one, it's written in the negative. Let me write it in the positive, or let me say it in the positive. Last year, it was reported that 60% of CEOs were Chinese. Now, that could be mainland Chinese, it could be Hong Kong Chinese, it could be American-born Chinese, but they were Chinese. This year, that number's down to 51%. Again, self-reported, but we had a reasonable sample. Similarly, for the next level down, 67% down to 56%. So while we can quibble about whether the trend really is enough to say it's gotten worse, we can have that discussion. But I think what we would say definitively is it certainly doesn't appear to have gotten better. Okay, let me move on to the final trend. There are 4 capability areas that we believe are paramount in this marketplace. 2 kind of surfaced last year, the whole topic of people and talent, and I mean that broadly defined, not just hiring people, but hiring, retaining, organizing the processes around them, et cetera, and go-to-market, or distribution, sales and marketing, whatever you want to call it. 2 more clearly surfaced this year. Product development and innovation, and marketing, communication, and branding. And when you think about this market, at least historically, I think most of us would say historically Chinese companies are advantaged on go-to-market. They kind of get how to get their product out into the marketplace. I think we would say multinationals, by and large, are advantaged around the whole topic of branding and probably marketing communication. I think we might agree that product development innovation is kind of split. Innovation probably belongs to the multinationals. Product development arguably could belong to the Chinese companies. They're pretty quick at getting new product out and responding quickly. And people and talent, probably no one's really captured. So it's not a huge surprise to us that we're seeing more and more joint ventures, acquisitions of Chinese companies and multinational companies. And we've only put 4 of them on the screen just to highlight the point. But what we would say is that we, Booz, do expect to see more and more of these types of relationships as companies try to fill their major capability gaps. Sounds like there's some interesting construction going on. Beyond M&A, though, beyond joint venture, if you're a company sitting in the audience, what do you want to be thinking about? So the first thing that we would say is you really need to think about those 4 capability areas, and maybe there's others, by the way. Those are the 4 that we believe are pretty consistent across all companies, but there might be others that are unique to your industry. But think about those 4 capabilities, and if you have major gaps in them, kind of make sure you know that. So for example, if you're a Chinese company, and if you believe you really are falling short on branding, or you're really falling short on innovation, just make sure that's front and center. The challenge, though, comes at the next level down, because at the next level down, you then need to think about what strategies you're going to develop against each of those capability areas. And here's where it gets really interesting, because companies believe they can do everything great, and they try and do everything great. And the reality is there are very few companies that can do everything great. You really need to figure out where you must be great in order to capture your right to win against your segment, your geographies, your competition, whatever, and where it's okay to be, we use the word in English, table stakes, meaning you're okay. You're at the threshold, but it's not really how and where you're going to differentiate yourself. And that's a very, very difficult thing for companies to do, but we would argue it's really important. And it's really important here in China because you do have this tendency that everything matters and I have to be great at everything. Third point, those strategies must then be mutually reinforcing, pointing in the right direction. And we use the word coherent. Because if you've got one set of processes that incent one set of behavior or take your company this direction, and then you've got a different set of strategies or processes that take your company this way, and by the way, that's very common, you have a problem. It's really hard to get your company pointed in one direction if everything is pointing in different directions. Okay? And then finally, somewhat unique to the Chinese marketplace, you guys have one more challenge here. there is this issue of nimbleness, speed, adaptation that's really, really critical to this marketplace. So at the end of the day, given all those strategies, you still have to be in a situation that you can respond quickly. I just want to close with one quote. As I mentioned at the onset, we had 5 or 6 companies that helped guide us through this survey process. And this was a quote by one of them, happened to be one of our Chinese executives. Value in terms of high quality is increasingly appreciated by consumers. However, most companies are not able to provide quality throughout the supply chain. Any company that can improve quality throughout the supply chain, throughout the chain, will be able to charge a premium and win more customers. This is a very, very senior executive. Okay, so let me close. Thank you. And I'm going to invite the panelists to the stage.
So thank you, Joni. Big shoes to fill. 30 years is a long time with firm, long time of the partnership. So we'll miss you. But over to the panel for now. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. We have about half an hour until the scheduled end time. We'll split it about in 2. So we'll talk with the panel amongst each other for a little bit. I'll ask some questions, see if the panelists want to play off each other, and then I'll open it up for questions at some point. We'll see how that goes. There's plenty of questions to go around. So the first question, just to get everybody started quickly, get everybody speaking. Question, what surprised you as individuals in the survey results that you just heard about, that you read about? What surprised you, and why do you believe it's relevant, either for your company or for your industry? Haiyan, do you wanna start?
Sure. Okay. Morning. I think rather than surprising me, it's probably something that resonates really deeply with me is when we talk about the capability gaps, especially when it comes to the branding, innovation, this type of capabilities. And associated with that is really, where do you go find those capabilities? How do you nurture, how do you develop those capabilities? I think that is something that both the multinational and Chinese-owned company are facing. That is, in the end, probably one of the #1 challenges that we face every single day, because in the end, people make things happen. If you can find them, or if you can grow them, that will be the most valuable asset that you have.
Good morning, everyone. There weren't that many surprises. If there were any surprise to me, it was the modesty of the Chinese companies and how quickly MNCs are learning to adapt to this new market. So I wouldn't say that the war is about to begin. I would say that Chinese consumers are really lucky to have all these people with so much energy and experiences from all around the world to serve them. So I look forward to a really prospering consumer market here.
Good morning. I think the survey findings in general are quite in line with our own internal assessment of the market. But one of the things that strikes me most is that the recognition between the Chinese and the foreign OEM, the convergence of the recognition that we are competing for the same sets of customers, we are competing for the same set of talents. And this appears in the second main key findings. So after all, we are all competing in the same market, regardless of the policy or the regulations that is in place, because in the auto sector is one of the most heavily regulated. So regardless or despite of all that, we are competing in the same market. Thank you.
Thanks. Good morning. The thing that didn't surprise me, and I was actually pleased, was how social media has become central to every organization, and people recognize that it's changing the whole equation. Joni, in her closing comments, talked about companies being nimble and adaptive, and actually social media is forcing them to make sure that you have capabilities to be able to do that. The thing that surprised me was, I think in the MNC sample, 30% said they were fully prepared to deal with social media. That I found most interesting, and at some point that will make for a longer discussion.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting comments. Picking it up from a consumer point of view, capabilities point of view, people point of view. Let's talk about the consumers just a little bit more, Cindy and Chin Lim. Joni spoke, quite some detail about value customers and choice customers, the difference between them, where they sit. How does that play out in your industry and for your company? How do you see that, and how do you address it?
Okay, since I have the mic in my hand, so I'll start first. It's interesting. I think that two trends of value consumer and choice consumer, in my view, is playing out in full bloom in the Chinese automotive market. It's difficult to draw a line. How much of the market is value, how much is choice. But we can see, if roughly, I would say, the growth of the luxury market, for example, in the past few years is growing at like 20-30% in at least the last 3 years. That is a good manifestation of the growth in this study we call it the value consumer. As you can see, people become wealthier. They are willing to pay more for luxury brands. Luxury brands, we are talking about cars that are sold for, say, 300,000 and above. And on the other hand, though, in the choice consumer, because foreign companies, MNCs like us, are also coming into play in the lower end of the market. That's introducing more choices to the lower part of the car buyers. So that two phenomena is playing in full bloom in the auto sector.
When we talk about trends, these are all trends, but if we look at it from a consumer standpoint, we look at it more from a mindset standpoint, not just trends. And these mindset coexist in even one single consumer. So give you one example, value doesn't really just mean luxurious or just mean premium, but it's all a relative term. So in a consumer industry such as ours, within pennies or within few renminbi, there's the difference between premium products and the pricier or the more economic choices. I wanted to mention one consumer that I met personally in her own room or her own home. She has only not even one bedroom apartment. It's a studio. That tells you a frugal life that she's leading, but she can spend more than 200 renminbi 2 to 3 times a week just on buying snacks. And so it tells you that she knows where to spend her money. She has her priority. So it's all a matter of how we as manufacturers or business people to understand their needs and try to get up to their priority spending list. So it's fascinating to me.
Okay, that's interesting, Cindy. So two segments, they live in one. So we're all schizophrenic, I guess, in the world today, certainly in China. Vinay and Haiyan, how do you, going over to the capability of brand building, right? How do you build brands in a market like that? How do you embed brands in a consumer's mind like that, which is one thing one day, another thing another day? How do you do that? Would you mind commenting on that a little bit?
Sure. I'll start. Okay. I guess when it comes to branding, one principle that we always try to hold true is to start with a good understanding of the consumer, just like Cindy was talking about. Without a good knowledge of who your consumers are, what their needs are, branding is meaningless. I mean, this is not necessarily a new concept, but it is not always easy to do. Maybe I can take an example of one of our own brands. And I don't know, some of you may be familiar with Chips Ahoy, which is a cookie biscuit brand. It is one of our offering to the young adults here in China. I mean, we do spend a lot of time trying to understand their life, going into the in-home visit, doing all different kind of discussion and talks, and understand their highs and lows at that particular life stage. And they're just fresh out of college and starting their new job. They're really excited, looking forward for some freedom. But then somehow life is turning out to be a lot harder than they expected. Work is a lot more boring than they expected. And so I think for them, in their daily life, they're looking for just small, tiny little moments of joy that can bring some fun back to their life, just like their college life. So those are some of the insights, some of the learning that we have. So to them, Chips Ahoy is not only just a little tasty cookie, but also it is a platform where they can connect and socialize with their friends. And then also they feel like it is a brand that they can relate to because the cookie guys are speaking their language. I don't know if you're familiar with some of the guys, the cookie guy characters that we have. We have the main cookie guy who is very goofy, always wanted to be the center of the spotlight. We have the chewy guy who can never decide what he wants. And we talk about it's more like a Shanghai 男人. And we have the we have the butter lady, who is just like a typical young 20-some-year-old lady that 1 minute could be an angel, the other minute is a monster. So those are the characters that we have created, and then they speak the language of our consumers. So in the end, this is a brand they feel like they can relate to. So I guess one of our learning is always to start with a good understanding of your consumer, and then we mean your local consumer, not something that you just take from your global company and trying to adapt. It's really getting to the local life.
And to add to what Haiyuan said, I think digital is, as everyone knows, is a game changer. The Chinese digital landscape is more complex and more exciting than I think any other digital landscape in the world. And I think if you take it beyond what companies are telling consumers, C2C is exploding or is bigger than any other part of the world and is exploding at a faster pace than anywhere in the world. And as companies, I think the challenge is to be able to understand what's going on in the marketplace, what consumers are saying to other people about your brand, about your company, about your product. And I think it's especially important to have a unified or a consistent voice in different media. So you do television, you do magazines. In the old world, media planners would be able to have a consistent plan, consistent voice across those media. In social media, you've got to adapt as well. So use the same business rules, but apply them with some diligence to these new platforms. And I think if you have one voice, you listen to the consumer, you align your company to company, brand, product, whatever voice you're adopting, to talk to them in a relevant manner, then you stand a chance of winning.
Great, thank you. So understanding the consumer, local consumer, really important. Consistency is important for branding. It strikes me that that's quite important for product innovation as well, or product development. Second capability that Joni talked about stood out. Chin Lim and Cindy, would you want to talk a little bit about that, innovation in China? What's different about it than in other parts of the world, or what's the same?
I was very happy to see the confidence or the foresight of seeing more and more investment in infrastructure. If there's a big difference between product or innovation development here versus the rest of the more developed markets, it's the lack of infrastructure or the lack of sophistication of infrastructure. That's one of them. And therefore, innovation in China becomes very challenging, starting from the understanding of true consumer insights, and not to fall into the pitfalls when a lot of the MNCs trying to leverage their knowledge and experiences from overseas, and a lot of the time when reporting back to the headquarters for the ease of getting the funding, a lot of the insights agencies are working for the senior executives sitting in the headquarters rather than working for the local consumers. So first step is to get the insights right underneath the skin. And then there's the whole 9 yards of what I like to say, that we are only as strong, or innovation is only as strong as the weakest link in the entire supply chain. And I totally agree with the closing comment that Joni shared with us from the senior executive from the Chinese company, is that we have to get every single part of the innovation right, and that is such a challenge in this country at this state. But I would say that because of the investment and the commitment, it's going to get much better pretty soon.
Thank you, Cindy. It's actually interesting to hear that we share, as big multinationals, share the same type of perhaps pain, trying to communicate the consumer insight in China to the headquarters. And sometimes I call that abstraction by PowerPoint presentation. So we tend to communicate the findings about consumer insights to the headquarters through PowerPoint, right? Thank you, Microsoft, for inventing that. And but there's so much abstraction going on as you collect consumer insight, not just for China, but for India or for Brazil, or for, and it gets abstracted, and some of the nuances are lost in the process. So that's one of the greatest challenges. In fact, that leads me to talk about some of the challenges we face about innovation in the car industry, because you hear a lot, and it's true that car company needs to go global. Sharing of global architecture, sharing of global components, modules, and so on, in order to drive economy of scale, and drive the cost down to stay competitive. And that's one major drive, I believe, adopted by most of the global company. On the other hand, though, you have to balance the local needs. And China market is so big now; it's bigger than about 1.5 times that of US, and in about 7 years' time or 6 years' time, it will be about double of US, and there will be more and more local product adaptation. We are doing a lot of that, but how do you balance global common versus local specificity? And that's always a tension, a struggle. On one hand, you want to and enjoy the economy of scale, innovative products for the local Chinese consumer. How do you get to corporate, the red tapes or the differences in opinions about the consumer insight? So that's always a struggle. But I have to say that at least among the Chinese JVs here, I am very impressed by the passion to learn. We have engineers in our local development centers that are fresh out of college or less than 30 years old. They have global perspective. They like to learn, and the willingness to learn is helping us to close some of the local development and the innovation gap. So that's a very encouraging sign. Thank you.
From India, but I teach in United States a course called Doing Business in Emerging Markets. And my question is, I'm kind of curious that I did not hear anywhere the word, the bottom of pyramid. There's so much of dialogue going on. And I hear this, tension of local versus global and all of that. But is that just the academic thought that, you should create something from the grounds up, and something that is done by, in Indian company Godrej, Chota Cool, which was actually kind of, input and designed by the bottom of the pyramid customer were put under single tent, and they did that. Versus simply looking at Beijing and Shanghai as the market, and only focusing on them. And this academic thought that, what's the point of coming to China if you're going to focus on only the top 300 or 400 million and going to leave out the bottom 1 billion? So I just want to have a, since I don't get to talk to practitioners very often, am I far removed from reality, or is it something that is, yet it will take time, or it's irrelevant?
You are totally not far off. In fact, you are very close to reality here, and that is a subject that we internally discuss. And also, it's a challenge for, I'm sure, my peers in the industry. But it also depends on the readiness of the organization. I still believe, despite the survey finding, I still believe that local Chinese companies or the Hong Kong and Taiwanese companies have a far cry advantage over their MNC counterparts in their readiness for the bottom of the pyramid, even still today. MNCs are still struggling to learn what's the cost-efficient and the nimble enough way to provide meaningful, the right products that can drive the penetration down to the bottom of the pyramid. And so it is a very important subject that MNCs are still learning our ropes.
Vinay, you want to comment on?
Just to add to what Cindy said, I think it's a question many businesses think about as well, because once there's market saturation or greater competition, you move out to tier 3, tier 4, you look at rural. It's the same thing that happens in India or any other big countries. From a digital and a social media perspective, that's really interesting as well, because you see that, again, anecdotally, there's not so much hard data to support it. But there are certain things that are more popular in tier 3 and 4 and beyond, certain instant messaging products that have been there for much longer. Certain aspects of social media are used more in tier 3 and 4. But their usage is also dependent on what products, brands, and companies reach out to these markets. So, for example, if there's a new luxury store that opens in a tier 3 or 4 town, there's more opportunity to create, well, generate information, share opinion, and seek other people's views, and therefore the usage and the buzz, increases and people become more aware. I think, to summarize, if you're looking at bottom of the pyramid, the thing that's contributing a lot or a great amount to it is consumer to consumer. And I cannot overemphasize how big that is. BBSs in China are unique to China, and that will actually is shifting more and more power to the consumer. Does that answer your question?
I think I would just maybe one thing to add on or to echo also some of the comments that Cindy made earlier. Rather than looking at a consumer through the lens of tier 1, tier 2, or 3 and 4, or by the different income, it's really more about their mindset, their need, their tendency. So we do a lot of tracking on the consumer behaviors over the years, and amazingly over the past few years, you see more and more consistency across the different tiers, across the different income levels. So I think it's really require us to look at the consumers from a different lens rather than just simply doing the segregation or segmentation like that. And then you're saying or seeing actually more and more of the behaviors from the lower tier cities are catching up with the top tier cities. At the end of the day, is really how you make sure that you look at them from just a human perspective, exactly what they're looking for, and not necessarily saying or worrying about how much they have in their pocket.
I would love to hear your views on a lot of value creation happens both locally as well as globally, especially for MNCs. If you, like you talked about the PowerPoint, taking consumer insights and communicating back to the corporate headquarters, sometimes you have information loss. Similarly, a lot of best practices that are generated, especially for the global iconic brands like some of you work for, and a lot of information gets lost, or the meaning of the information or the brand equity gets lost when you try to transport it to India or China or Brazil or Mexico, wherever else. What have been some of your experiences in establishing your brand in these markets? So maybe an example would be very helpful.
Find a better way to leverage all the power of our global brands, and we do have a lot of them. So in the end, it's really making sure that you have a system inside your organization that is working in terms of the flow of the knowledge and the best practices, and then also making sure there's a clear articulation of some of the equity guidelines and things that you will always hold true no matter which part of the world you are in. And then at the same time, also be very clear about what are some of the aspects that is absolutely up to you based on your local insight, that where you can actually go and then innovate. So setting up those clear parameters and then having those clear articulations and have a system in place where everybody knows where to go to get what you need, and that has been proven to be very helpful here. And then like Oreo, everybody knows the brand, and if you look at a commercial, no matter it's here in China or any other parts of the globe, you instantly getting that connection, that emotional bonding between the parents and the kids. But then at the same time, you're seeing all the different innovations here in China, like what we have, the ice cream Oreo, which is actually a first in the whole world. So the U.S. is actually adopting that concept, that product from us. So this is actually a good example of actually what you want to keep, what you wanted to innovate, and then how do you work together as one single system.
I think branding is not everything, but branding, it gives a very competitive edge. It's like a double-edged sword. So my questions to any of the panels up there is that, because I see like Shanghai, we're lack of branding. We have a lot of bombardment from all kind of like MNC companies, whether it's the F&B market or in the luxury end or even the automotive industry. I mean, how do we foster or build our own branding or our name brand, homegrown branding, and what's the process? And maybe if one of your panels can address this issue to us and to me, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
I have an opinion on a part of it, and hopefully some of my colleagues in the panel will correct me if I'm wrong or add to it. I think there is clutter generally in media around the world, and it's apparent in the big cities in China, and even when you go into tier 3 and 4, and from what I understand, it is there. It's important to have a clear branding strategy in terms of what you stand for, and you've got to make a view on what your content is, what your messaging is, and what your platforms are. And it sounds fluffy, but actually it's not. Because it means you can then focus on where you want to go for impact or reach. And there are a lot of companies which then try, if they don't have big budgets to compete with some of their larger competitors, you try and use creativity to make people talk about you. So for example, in the space that I know a little bit, internet word of mouth is really important. So if you create an event or you have an idea where there's buzz and you get people talking, consumers are clever people. And they normally know your product or your brand or what you stand for more than many people in the organization you represent. So if you can get them to be advocates or fans of what you stand for and what you are offering people, you stand a chance.
Okay.
I think it is probably more speaking from more kind of the learnings how we do it from a more FMCG company perspective. Is number one, I mean, branding is not something like where you just go and hire a celebrity and then having that person go on the commercial and do something and trying to do that really won't last too long unless you really do have something to hold true. So at the end of the day, I think probably two things are very critical. One is basically have a very clear identification of who you wanted to talk to, with this, what kind of consumer this brand is for. Sometimes it's definitely people tend to do, I want to do things for all people, and then you ended up accomplishing nothing. So have a very good understanding exactly who you want to talk to. And then for that person, exactly what you can offer. Whatever you're promising, you have to be able to deliver. If it's basically an empty check, there's nothing, you won't last. So the delivery on that promise is very key. So this whole thing about what do you do with your consumer. The other aspect is how do you stand up against your competition. So in the end, you have to have something that can truly differentiate yourself. That is something that nobody else can easily to copy. And that give you the chance to stay, to stand out, to last. So those two clear aspects, if we can have a very good handle on, you have a good chance of actually staying and then standing out.
I want to just speak very quickly about the brand, one of our joint venture brand. Last year, I think in the May timeframe, Forbes magazine, the front cover, the most important vehicle in the world, and that's made by one of our partners. The brand is Wuling. And I absolutely agree with Haiyan. You have to know where your target customer are and how to grow them. I think Wuling sold about 1.2 million vehicles last year, and they have a 40% share of the minivan, mini commercial market. The important thing here is that we bring in our best practices, our concept of branding, but we work with the local partners because they know how to get to the markets in the lower end. We do not want to impose all the tools or technique in the mature market, but they are good learnings from our methodology, and we listen to them. It's a marriage of their local practice and our best practices, marry them together, let them execute. You have to trust your local partner a lot, and they will learn from us as well. So I think the key message here is the marriage of the best practices globally and the local know-how. I think that's very important in building a brand.
Hi, my name is Mike Padawada, Head of Strategy at Statsit. I have a question about the challenges, the capability gap that you guys had mentioned and were surprised about in terms of branding as well as for product innovation. I also noted on the slide about key challenges. Right at the bottom was this, the ability to make partnerships work. So given that you've got that strength, and that was something that was just touched upon here, are you considering different kinds of partnerships, new kinds of partnerships that you haven't looked at before, perhaps with agencies, like from our side being a small, relatively small agency, looking at that to bridge the gap for in terms of those capabilities. So what are you considering? What are you putting on the table in terms of new partnerships?
My view is quite simple, actually. It's an extension of what Chin Lim said earlier. I think it is to base a lot of your partnerships on local know-how. And what multinationals can bring is maybe methodologies, experience in other markets. But to win, you've got to have a local presence and people who understand this, the culture and get under the skin. So that, I think, is directionally where we would look.
Yeah, I have to stay a little bit more philosophical here. I think you need to recognize that the partnership will grow. The JV partner wants to learn from you. In the first 3 years, they want to learn from you. In the next 3 years, they want to grow and be perceived like you. In another 3 years, they want to be perhaps better than you. So you do need to recognize that and say, that's fine. You know, I respect that the relationship will change, the rules will change, the negotiation terms will change, but I'm willing to take that bet and I'm willing to commit to a longer term partnership. I think that is how I interpret trust, you know, over the different period of time. Thank you.
That's an excellent question, by the way. And I'm going to focus on the other side of the equation, which is the smaller partners or the service providers. And for those of you in the room that are service providers who are offering your service to be partners, my take is that no one can win alone in this market, and partnership is truly where our strength will come from. And to Joni's earlier part is that you really need to understand which part is your strength and which part you can leverage your partners, whether it be a JV partner or whether it be a co-packing partner, whether it be a service consulting partner. But the key is that whether you are selecting the partners that truly understand this market better than you do in their specific area. And a lot of the times, our service providers are not localized. And so that's a barrier for us to be willing to collaborate with the international service providers. So that's the only key that we like to make sure.
Similar, I wanted to talk about is really more on the front of how you work with agencies, especially in our industry. We do work with a lot of communication agencies. I think one of the learnings is really making sure that, just like Cindy said, you have a clear understanding of what you can bring to the table, each one of you, your strengths and your kind of weakness. So in the end, that marriage has to be complementary. And then sometimes here the local agency comes in and play a big role in kind of our approach trying to reach the local Chinese consumer. This year, we are partnering with Tencent, the biggest basically digital platform here in China, and we're trying to celebrate Oreo's 100 years birthday, 100 years anniversary. So we are working together over quite a number of the platforms on QQ, on their IM, on the Tengxun Weibo and everything. So this is what QQ can bring to us, is basically a platform, a user base that is over 500 million. And what we can bring to the table is the power of our brand, is Oreo, is a brand with a meaning. So far, as an example, only a couple months into the celebration, we were able to engage over 40 million Chinese consumers to carry out over 50 million Oreo missions. So that is the power of basically the partnership. What we can bring and what they can bring, the marriage is absolutely a good and happy marriage.
I can't thank you all enough. Your insights were just terrific, and I hope all of you take away something from here to help continue to grow your businesses and be able to penetrate the Chinese consumer market. So again, please join me in thanking the panelists, Steve, Joni, and Booz.